Hello everyone, my name is Cassian Duimana from Burundi. I'm part of the participants in the training course on Policy Advocacy in Genetics and Genomics. We have a debate on the following topic. Should traditional hunting practices be restricted based on genomic risk assessments of zoonotic disease emergence? I'm in Group 2, Affirmative Team, together with my colleague Wilberforce Kalule from Uganda. Hunting is the activity of chasing and killing or catching wild animals for various reasons, such as for food, sport, or wildlife management. Hunting is an important source of food, income, and cultural identity in many communities. However, certain hunting practices can increase the risk of zoonotic disease transmission. It is recognized that 75% of emerging diseases are zoonotic. In fact, human, animal, and environmental health are deeply interconnected. Restrictions are necessary to organize hunting practices while protecting the population from zoonotic transmission. We must recognize the overwhelming scientific evidence that roughly 75% of new emerging infectious diseases originate from animals, and large fractions of those come from wildlife. Traditional hunting and the consumption of wild animals routinely bring humans into direct contact with blood, tissues, and pathogens, dramatically raising the likelihood of viral spillover. In light of modern genomic methods, it is possible to identify which species and their contexts pose the highest zoonotic risk. It is both rational and necessary to restrict traditional hunting practices, not to condemn culture, but to safeguard human health and prevent the next global outbreak. Many of the deadly human diseases originated from animals. We can note many examples, including HIV, which originated from non-human primates, SARS-CoV-2, and Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, which originated from bats, but also Ebola and Marburg virus from bats or infected wildlife, and so on. Hunting itself is not dangerous. The risk comes from how, where, and which animals are hunted. It is possible to reduce the risk for zoonotic spillover while preserving the cultural and livelihood value of hunting through a combination of public health guidance, genomic surveillance, and community engagement. Unregulated traditional hunting, bushmeat butchering, and the wildlife trade create repeated direct opportunities for dangerous pathogens to spill over to humans. With today's genomic and ecological tools, we can identify high-risk species and contexts, enabling targeted restrictions that protect global health without condemning entire traditions. Genomic data can identify high-risk species early. Genomic surveillance reveals viruses and pathogens with spillover potential. Examples: we can note identification of the SARS-CoV-2 receptor binding protein that allowed the virus to cross the species barrier from bats to humans, but also close evolutionary relationships between HIV and SIV suggest a zoonotic spillover from non-human primates to humans. Early identification allows targeted restrictions on high-risk interactions. When high-risk pathogens are detected in wildlife or livestock, public health authorities can put in place targeted and fair restrictions to reduce the interactions. In this process, community engagement is crucial. Restrictions can be targeted, not a ban on cultural practices. The restrictions should not apply to all the animals. The policy can focus on the following aspects: specific species with high zoonotic potential, high-risk seasons or regions, unsafe handling or trade practices. African countries face repeated zoonotic threats. African countries are at the highest risk of zoonotic threats due to richness in diversity and dense human-animal interactions. We have many examples, including Ebola, Marburg, monkeypox, Rift Valley fever, and other have strong wildlife origins. We know that prevention is better than a cure. Therefore, preventing a spillover is far cheaper than controlling outbreaks. We remember the negative socioeconomic and public health impact of the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. If this could have been averted through restrictions, it would have been possible to save many lives. Reducing zoonotic risk protects livelihoods. Disease outbreaks have a devastating economic impact across several sectors. In tourism, we note travel restrictions, border closure, and public fear. Hotels, restaurants, markets, and airlines closure, resulting in huge revenue losses. In agriculture, we note a reduction in the workforce available for agricultural activities. Genomic-informed policies reduce national vulnerability. Early evidence-based interventions reduce the potential impact of diseases. Countries have an ethical duty to protect citizens. Governments must use the best available science, including genomics, to prevent avoidable outbreaks. What policymakers need is real-time and accurate data to inform the design of interventions. A failure to act when genomic evidence exists is a failure of public health responsibility. It is a duty of the government and health authorities to protect the population, and failing to act when evidence has been provided could be seen as a breach of this duty and a failure of responsibility. While opponents may argue that traditional hunting is an essential cultural practice of food source, we cannot ignore the mounting scientific evidence linking wildlife hunting and bushmeat consumption to zoonotic spillover. The limited but growing data show that hunting, butchering, and preparing wild animals sharply increase opportunities for pathogen transmission, especially when in contact with blood tissues or carcasses of high-risk species such as primates. Zoonotic spillover results in emerging diseases for which vaccination becomes available after significant damage or not at all. Moreover, awareness of the danger does not translate into safer handling. Given that modern genomic and ecological tools allow us to identify high-risk species and contexts, we must act not by condemning all traditions, but by restricting and regulating those practices that pose demonstrable threats. The health of our communities and indeed global biosafety depends on this prudent, science-driven approach. Therefore, we must restrict those traditional hunting practices flagged by genomic risk assessments because the cost of inaction may very well be our next pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention.